The sky turned dark without warning, and heavy rain poured down like the heavens had opened. The human traveler, soaked from head to toe, pushed through the muddy path, searching for shelter. His boots sank deep with every step, and thunder cracked above, shaking the ground. He spotted an old stone hut near the riverbank and ran toward it, desperate to escape the storm. But the moment he reached the door, he froze. Someone was already inside. She was an alien girl, her glowing eyes staring back at him with sharp suspicion. Her clothes were just as wet as his, sticking to her frame as she tried to stay warm. She hissed softly, warning him not to come closer, but a violent flash of lightning tore across the sky, followed by a deafening crack of thunder. Both flinched. The rain was no longer rain, it was a flood. Water spilled over the banks of the river and rushed down with terrifying speed. The human didn't wait for her permission. He pushed inside, and she didn't have time to stop him. At first, they stayed apart, each watching the other with distrust. She was trembling, not from fear, but from cold. He wrapped his arms around himself, shivering as well. The storm howled like a beast outside, and the ground began to shake. The walls of the hut leaked, small streams of water creeping in. The human cursed under his breath. The girl tilted her head, confused by the strange word, but understanding the worry in his eyes. Then the flood came harder. Water began to pour through the doorway, rushing across the floor, rising inch by inch. Both stood quickly, backing away. The human looked for something to block the entrance, but there was nothing. The alien girl clutched her arms around herself, her teeth chattering. The rising water climbed to their knees, cold as ice. He knew that if they didn't get out soon, they would drown in the hut. He pointed to the roof, shouting over the roar of the storm. She shook her head furiously. She didn't trust him. She thought maybe he was tricking her. But when another wave slammed against the walls and the hut shook like it would collapse, she had no choice. He moved first, pushing at the wooden beams, and the two of them climbed through a narrow gap into the dark, stormy night. The floodwater was everywhere, a violent river where land once stood. The human grabbed her arm, pulling her forward as debris rushed by. Broken logs, branches, even pieces of the hut itself. She struggled, her feet slipping. The water was heavy, pulling them down, pushing them into the current. She screamed when a floating log slammed into her side, and he dragged her up before she could go under. Both were already shivering so hard their lips turned blue. Their wet clothes dragged them down like chains. The human knew they couldn't keep them on. With shaking hands, he pulled off his heavy jacket and threw it aside, then ripped at his shirt, tossing it into the water. She gasped when she saw him doing it, thinking it was madness. But when her own dress wrapped tightly around her legs, nearly pulling her under, she realized he was right. Slowly, with hesitation, she tore it away, leaving herself almost bare in the freezing rain. The storm didn't care about shame. The storm wanted to kill them. Their only chance was survival. They stumbled through the rushing water until they found a stone ridge rising slightly above the flood. Both crawled onto it, panting, their skin shaking violently from cold. The human lay back, gasping for air, while the alien girl hugged her knees, watching him with wide eyes. The water roared all around them, black and endless. Minutes passed, but the rain didn't stop. Lightning lit up the sky, showing them just how bad it was. Trees ripped out from the ground, houses swept away, everything swallowed by the furious flood. The alien girl whispered something in her own language, maybe a prayer, maybe a curse. The human couldn't understand, but he could see the fear in her eyes. She looked at him, as if blaming him for being there, as if his presence made the situation worse. But then another surge of water hit the ridge, splashing over their bodies. She lost her balance, and before she could fall back into the flood, his hand caught her wrist. Their eyes locked. For the first time, she didn't pull away. For the first time, she let him hold her. The ridge was small, and the storm was relentless. They couldn't stay there forever. The human scanned the darkness, searching for higher ground. His teeth chattered so hard he could barely speak, but he pointed again, urging her to follow. She hesitated, her pride battling her fear, but she finally nodded. Together, they climbed, step by slippery step, as the water chased them. The alien girl slipped again, her foot caught on a rock. She cried out in pain, but the human didn't stop. He crouched, pulled her arm over his shoulder, and half dragged, half carried her upward. She was lighter than he expected, fragile even, but every step felt like a war against the raging flood. Their breaths were ragged, their bodies shivering, yet they pushed on. When they finally reached a small cave on the hillside, both collapsed inside. They were shaking, half naked, soaked to the bone, but alive. For a moment, neither spoke. Only the sound of their heavy breathing filled the cave. Then, in the silence, their eyes met again. They were strangers, enemies maybe, but the storm had forced them together. Outside, the flood roared, but inside that small cave, a new tension was born, one that neither of them could ignore. The cave was dark, cold, and small. Drops of water fell from the ceiling and echoed in the silence. The human sat on one side, his back against the wall, breathing heavily. The alien girl sat across from him, her knees pulled close to her chest, her glowing eyes fixed on him with sharp suspicion. They were safe from the flood for now, but the sound of rushing water outside reminded them that danger was still close. Both of them were shivering. Their wet clothes clung to their skin like ice, making their bodies shake uncontrollably. The human rubbed his arms, trying to warm himself, but it was useless. The alien girl hugged her knees tighter, her teeth chattering. She refused to move closer to him, even though the cold was stealing her strength. The silence between them was heavy. The human tried to speak, but she didn't answer. He pointed at the entrance of the cave where the flood roared past. She understood his gesture. He was saying they couldn't go out yet. Still, she narrowed her eyes, as if she thought he had other plans. The human sighed. He leaned back against the stone wall, closing his eyes for a moment. His body was tired from fighting the current, his chest still aching from holding his breath under the water. When he opened his eyes again, he noticed her staring at him. The moment their eyes met, she quickly looked away, her cheeks flushing faintly. Another gust of cold wind blew through the cave. Both shivered at the same time. Finally, the human pointed at the fire rocks scattered near the wall. He picked up 2 stones and struck them together, sparks flying in the darkness. The alien girl's eyes widened in surprise. She had not seen a human use tools this way before. He tried again and again until a spark caught on a small piece of dried grass. Slowly, carefully, he blew on it, and a tiny flame came to life. The warmth spread through the cave. The alien girl's face softened slightly, though she didn't admit it. She inched a little closer, pretending she only wanted to warm her hands. The human noticed, but didn't say a word. He fed more grass into the fire, then small sticks until the flame grew strong. Finally, the cold air began to retreat, and their shaking slowed. Still, the tension remained. She looked at him, and then at the entrance. She finally spoke, her voice soft and filled with distrust. He couldn't understand her language fully, but the tone was clear. She was asking why he was here. He shook his head, pointing to the storm outside. She frowned, not satisfied with his answer. A loud crack echoed from outside. A tree had been pulled down by the flood and smashed against the rocks. The cave shook slightly. She gasped and looked at him again. For a moment, fear replaced suspicion. The human nodded firmly, as if telling her to stay calm. Hours passed slowly. The rain outside never stopped, and the water kept rising higher. The fire was small but steady, giving them some warmth. The alien girl's distrust began to weaken. She watched the human carefully. His hands were rough, his body scarred in places, proof that he had lived through many battles or struggles. She wondered how such a fragile-looking creature had managed to survive so far. But then he coughed hard, bending forward with pain. She jumped a little, unsure if he was hurt or sick. He waved his hand to show it was nothing, but she kept watching him. Something inside her shifted. Maybe curiosity, maybe pity. She reached out slowly, almost touching his shoulder, but stopped halfway. Instead, she pulled her hand back and hugged herself again. The human noticed her movement, but he didn't call her out. He simply leaned back, staring at the fire, lost in thought. The storm roared louder, and soon water began to seep into the cave again. Not much, but enough to remind them they couldn't stay forever. The human stood and walked to the entrance, looking out into the darkness. The alien girl followed, careful to keep some distance. Outside, the flood had turned the world into a black sea, with trees and broken houses floating in the current. She gasped quietly, realizing just how dangerous it was. He pointed toward the far side, where faint shapes of higher ground could be seen through the rain. His meaning was clear. They would need to move again once the water lowered. She shook her head fiercely, terrified of leaving the cave. He looked at her with determination, then back at the horizon. He wasn't going to stay trapped here. Another silence fell, but this time it felt different. She didn't see him only as a stranger anymore. She had watched him build fire, fight the flood, and keep moving forward. She was beginning to believe he was not weak. The firelight flickered across the cave walls, casting their shadows together. The alien girl stretched her arms, finally sitting closer to the warmth. Their shoulders were still apart, but not as far as before. She gave him one last suspicious glance before closing her eyes. Her body was exhausted, her spirit drained. Within moments, she was asleep. The human stayed awake, staring at the fire. He could hear the storm, feel the chill, and sense the distrust still hanging between them. But he also knew something had changed. She had chosen to sleep near him, even if just for warmth. That small step meant survival was no longer just about fighting the storm. It was about learning to trust each other. The night dragged on, heavy with rain and wind, but inside the cave, two strangers, once divided by fear and distrust, sat near the same flame. Neither said it aloud, but both understood. If they wanted to live through this flood, they would have to stay together, no matter how complicated things became. When morning came, the storm had not ended. The sound of rushing water was louder, and the cave entrance looked even more dangerous than before. The human leaned forward, peering out carefully. Everything below was still covered by the flood. The alien girl woke slowly, her body stiff and weak from the cold. She rubbed her arms, blinking at the dim fire that had nearly died. The smoke curled up lazily, and the small flame looked ready to vanish at any moment. She glanced at the human who was still staring outside, his jaw tight. He turned back to her and pointed deeper into the cave. His meaning was clear. They couldn't leave through the entrance. The water was too wild. They would have to go further inside. She shook her head quickly, her glowing eyes wide with fear. The tunnels were dark, unknown, and possibly dangerous. But he insisted. He gestured at the water rising closer and closer. The message was simple: stay and drown. Reluctantly, she nodded. The human grabbed a piece of burning wood from the fire to use as a torch. The orange light lit up the walls, showing rough stones, dripping water, and narrow paths. Their shadows stretched long behind them as they moved slowly into the deeper cave. The air inside was damp and heavy. The tunnel became smaller with every step, forcing them to crouch. The human led the way, holding the torch high. The alien girl followed close, though she kept her distance just enough so she wouldn't brush against him. The sound of the flood faded behind them, replaced by the echo of water drops falling steadily from the ceiling. The tunnel twisted left, then right, sometimes forcing them to crawl on hands and knees. The human's breath was heavy, his muscles sore from the night's struggle. The alien girl tried to move silently, her movements graceful compared to his. But even she could not hide the way her body trembled. The cold air bit into their skin, and the closeness of the cave pressed down on them like a weight. At one point, the tunnel narrowed so much that only one person could pass at a time. The human squeezed through first, his shoulders scraping against the stone. His torch flickered as he pushed forward. He turned back, reaching out a hand. The alien girl stared at it for a long moment, her pride and distrust holding her still. But the space was too tight and the rocks too sharp. If she slipped, she would injure herself badly. Finally, with a sharp breath, she placed her hand in his and let him pull her through. The touch was brief, but in that moment, something changed. She didn't hiss or pull away. Instead, she looked at him with a strange expression, as if seeing him differently for the first time. He said nothing, only moved forward. The tunnel opened slightly after that, giving them room to stand. But the relief didn't last long. Strange sounds echoed ahead, low growls, deep scratches against stone. The alien girl stiffened, her ears twitching toward the noise. She whispered something quickly in her own language, her voice sharp with fear. The human didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. Danger. The torchlight trembled as his hand tightened around it. The sound grew louder, like something big dragging itself across the floor. He motioned for her to stay behind him. For once, she didn't argue. She clutched her arms to her chest, her glowing eyes darting nervously in the dark. The air grew hotter, heavier. The human's heartbeat pounded in his ears. Every step forward felt like stepping into a trap. He lifted the torch higher, scanning the walls. The shadows seemed to move, crawling across the stone like living things. Then, from deep inside the cave, two eyes reflected the firelight back at them. They weren't human. They weren't hers. The alien girl gasped softly, her voice breaking. The human froze, his muscles tight. The growl deepened, vibrating through the walls. Something massive shifted in the dark, its body scraping against the rock. He could feel its weight in the air, its hunger pressing toward them. The alien girl pressed closer to him without thinking. Her fear was so strong, she forgot her distrust. Her hand brushed his arm, trembling. He steadied his breathing, forcing himself to stay calm. He had no weapon, only a torch, his fists, and his instincts. Slowly, he stepped back, pulling her with him. But the creature moved too, following their light, its claws scraping sparks against the stone. The human raised the torch higher, trying to look braver than he felt. The flame flickered across a huge, scaled body pressed against the walls. It was a predator, trapped in the cave like them, its sharp teeth glistening with saliva. The alien girl clutched his arm tightly now, no longer hiding her fear. For a moment, no one moved. The torch crackled, the predator growled, and their breathing filled the silence. Then the human made a decision. He lowered the torch slightly, grabbed the alien girl's hand, and pulled her toward another narrow path to the left. She stumbled, but didn't resist. They ducked into the smaller tunnel just as the predator roared, the sound shaking the stones. The cave shook as the beast slammed against the walls, chasing the light. Rocks fell around them, and the alien girl screamed as one nearly struck her. The human pulled her faster, his own breath ragged, but he didn't let go of her hand. The tunnel twisted sharply, and the predator's body was too large to follow. Its roar echoed in frustration, fading behind them as they stumbled deeper into the dark. Finally, they stopped, both gasping, their hearts pounding. The alien girl collapsed to her knees, trembling. The human leaned against the wall, sweat mixing with the cold air. Their eyes met in the flickering light. The alien girl's distrust had been replaced by something else, uncertain respect. She had seen him face danger with nothing but a torch and courage. And even when the beast came close, he had not abandoned her. The cave was still dangerous, the storm outside still raging, but for the first time, the alien girl began to think that maybe, just maybe, the human was not her enemy. Maybe he was her only chance to survive. The cave grew even darker as they moved forward. The torchlight flickered, throwing strange shadows across the stone walls. Every drop of water that fell from the ceiling echoed like a warning, and the alien girl's glowing eyes darted around nervously. The human walked in front, his grip tight on the burning stick, trying to act confident, though his heart beat fast. They had escaped the narrow tunnel, but the deeper they went, the stronger the feeling became that something was watching them. The air was thick, heavy, and full of a strange smell. It wasn't just damp stone or wet moss. It was sharper, almost metallic, like blood. The alien girl's face tightened. She recognized the scent before he did. Her people had spoken about it in whispers, the mark of a predator that should not be disturbed. She reached for his arm, tugging at it, shaking her head in warning. But the human only looked at her with a firm expression. They had no choice but to go forward. The flood had cut off their escape. The tunnel widened into a larger chamber, high above with jagged rocks hanging down like teeth. The torchlight revealed bones scattered across the ground, some broken, some cracked open. The alien girl gasped, covering her mouth. She stepped back, but the human crouched low, picking up a skull. It wasn't human. It was alien, long and sharp, with deep bite marks across the surface. He dropped it quickly, his face hardening. Then the growl came again. This time it wasn't far. It was close, vibrating through the ground. The human turned sharply, raising the torch, his eyes scanning the chamber. The alien girl grabbed his arm without thinking, her body pressed close in fear. The sound grew louder, echoing from the shadows. A pair of glowing eyes appeared, low to the ground, stalking them from behind the rocks. The human felt his breath catch, but he forced himself to stay calm. He pushed the girl behind him, holding the torch higher. The beast moved into the light slowly, step by step, revealing its body. It was huge, with scales black as night, its claws sharp enough to cut through stone, and its mouth lined with teeth dripping with saliva. Its body rippled with strength, muscles flexing as it lowered its head, ready to pounce. The alien girl whispered in her own language, her voice shaking. She had heard of this predator before. Some called it a cave demon, a hunter that killed anything trapped in its territory. No one survived long in its presence. She pulled at the human's arm, begging him to run. But he stood still, his eyes locked on the monster. Running in the flood would be useless. There was no way out. The predator snarled, stepping closer. The human's mind raced. He had no weapon except the torch, and even that wouldn't last long. Fire might scare it, but not for long. His eyes flicked around the chamber, searching for anything he could use. Bones, rocks, broken pieces of old weapons. Yes, something. He bent quickly, grabbing a sharp bone, holding it like a dagger in his other hand. The alien girl gasped again, not expecting him to face it. She thought he was insane. But as the predator lunged, the human threw the torch forward, straight into its face. Flames and smoke blinded it for a moment, and the beast roared in anger. The cave shook with the sound, rocks falling from above. The human shouted, pushing the girl back. He swung the sharp bone with all his strength, striking across the beast's snout. The creature howled, thrashing its head. The alien girl stumbled, falling against the wall, her heart pounding. She had never seen anyone fight like this. He had no armor, no claws, no natural weapons, and yet he stood his ground against the predator. He dodged left, then right, grabbing broken rocks from the ground and hurling them into its eyes. The beast roared again, slamming its claws against the floor, sending cracks through the stone. She couldn't stay frozen any longer. Something inside her broke free. With a sharp cry, she lifted her hands, and strange blue energy sparked from her skin. It was a hidden gift from her species, one she rarely used, but now she had no choice. The energy flashed through the air, striking the predator's flank. The beast recoiled, its body jerking in pain, smoke rising from the wound. The human's eyes widened in shock, but he didn't waste time. He charged forward while the beast was distracted, plunging the bone weapon deep into its side. The predator roared in fury, snapping its jaws inches from his face. He rolled away just in time, hitting the ground hard. The alien girl screamed his name, though she hadn't meant to. Her voice shook with fear that he would not rise again. But he did. He forced himself up, his chest heaving, his arms shaking. Blood dripped from his hands, but his eyes were still burning with determination. The predator, wounded but not dead, circled them with rage. The girl stepped closer to him, her energy flickering again. For the first time, she stood beside him, not behind him. Together, they fought. He struck with bones and rocks, using his clever mind to distract and wound. She blasted with sparks of her strange power, weakening the beast. Every second felt like an eternity, the cave echoing with snarls, shouts, and the crackle of fire. Finally, with one last strike, the human shoved a sharp stone deep into the predator's chest while the alien girl's energy flared bright, burning through its scales. The beast let out a final roar that shook the chamber, then collapsed to the ground, its body twitching before going still. The cave fell silent except for their ragged breathing. The alien girl stared at the human, her chest rising and falling, her glowing eyes wide with disbelief. He dropped the bloodied stone, collapsing to his knees, exhausted. She rushed forward without thinking, catching his arm, steadying him before he could fall. Their faces were close, breaths mixing in the damp air. For the first time, she did not see him as weak. For the first time, she felt something strange, a mix of respect, gratitude, and confusion. He had fought for her, risked everything, and never let go. The predator was dead, but the silence that followed carried new weight. The storm outside still raged, but inside the cave, another storm had begun, one between them, complicated, unspoken, and impossible to ignore. The predator's body lay still in the center of the chamber, its black scales glistening in the dying firelight. Smoke rose faintly from the wounds where the alien girl's strange energy had burned into it. The human sat against the wall, his chest rising and falling heavily, sweat and blood mixing on his skin. His arm trembled as he tried to wipe his face, but exhaustion weighed him down. The alien girl stood near him, her glowing eyes fixed on his battered form. She had never seen such stubbornness, such refusal to surrender. Among her people, survival meant strength of the body, the sharpness of claws, and the gift of their energy. But this human had fought with nothing but broken bones, rocks, and courage. Even when the predator was about to kill him, he had not run. He had shielded her, even when he could have saved himself by leaving her behind. For a moment, she simply stared, caught between confusion and respect. She stepped closer, kneeling by his side. Her hands shook as she reached out to check his arm, where blood dripped slowly from a deep cut. He winced, but didn't push her away. Their eyes met, and for a breath, silence spoke louder than words. The girl looked down quickly, her face flushed with emotions she didn't understand. She pressed her palm against his wound, and a faint spark of her energy passed into him. It wasn't strong enough to heal completely, but it slowed the bleeding. He gasped at the sudden warmth and looked at her in surprise. She avoided his gaze, focusing only on his arm. Outside, the storm still raged, the sound of the flood roaring through the tunnels. The cave trembled now and then, as if the earth itself was restless. But inside, the firelight softened and their breathing slowly steadied. After a while, the human tried to stand. His legs wobbled, and he leaned against the wall for support. The alien girl grabbed his arm quickly, steadying him. "Stay," she said in broken human language, the first time she had spoken his tongue. His eyes widened, not at the word itself, but at the fact that she had tried. But the human only shook his head. He pointed toward the tunnel that led deeper into the mountain. His meaning was clear. They couldn't stay in the predator's den. More creatures might come. The girl's lips pressed together tightly, but she knew he was right. She helped him walk, her hand supporting his side as they moved slowly forward. The tunnel ahead was narrow, but after what they had faced, it felt less terrifying than before. The flickering torchlight cast their shadows close together on the walls. The girl stole small glances at him as they walked, her thoughts racing. Why had he risked his life? Why had he not abandoned her when he had the chance? Among her people, only family or bonded partners fought with such desperation. She couldn't understand why a stranger would do the same. The human, though weak, noticed her gaze. He didn't speak, but there was a faint, tired smile on his face. It wasn't mockery, and it wasn't pride. It was simply a quiet smile that said he was glad they were still alive. That simple expression made her chest tighten in a way she didn't expect. She quickly turned her head away, pretending to study the tunnel walls. As they moved deeper, the ground sloped upward. It was a sign that they might find a higher exit, a place safe from the flood. But every step was harder for him. His body was slowing, his wounds burning with pain. At one point, he stumbled, falling to his knees. The torch slipped from his hand and rolled across the ground. Panic rose in her chest, and she rushed to him, lifting the torch back up before the fire could die. She crouched in front of him, her face close to his, her voice firm though it trembled. She spoke quickly in her own language, scolding him. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the emotion. She was angry, not because she hated him, but because she feared he might die. He let out a small laugh, even though his body hurt. That laugh only made her glare more, but behind her sharp look, there was something softer. She pulled his arm around her shoulder and forced him up. Though smaller than him, she carried as much of his weight as she could. Step by step, they moved forward again. The cave twisted sharply, and soon the sound of the storm grew fainter. It was replaced by a soft rushing noise, fresh air. The girl's ears twitched, and her eyes lit up. An exit was near. But before they could reach it, the tunnel widened into another chamber. Unlike the predator's den, this one was calm, filled with glowing moss that lit the walls in a gentle green light. A small pool of clear water sat in the center, fed by a trickle from the rocks. The girl gasped at the sight. Safe water, glowing moss for warmth. It was a perfect place to rest. The human collapsed near the pool, scooping water into his hands, drinking greedily. She watched him for a moment, then joined him, drinking carefully. The cool water washed away some of the fear in her chest. They both sat silently, the light of the moss painting their faces in soft colors. After a while, the girl leaned back against the stone, her glowing eyes studying him again. This time, she didn't look away. Her distrust was fading, replaced by something she couldn't explain. She whispered softly in her own language, words he couldn't understand, but her tone was gentle. He tilted his head, curious, and she only shook her head, a faint smile touching her lips. They were still trapped in a cave, the storm still roared outside, but for the first time, they felt something different. Not just survival, Not just fear, but connection. The predator had tested them, forced them to fight side by side. And in that fight, something new had been born between them, fragile, unspoken, but stronger than either expected. As the human leaned back, closing his eyes for rest, the alien girl stayed awake, watching him. Her people would never forgive her for trusting him, but in that moment, none of it mattered. What mattered was that he was alive, and because of him, so was she. And deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning of something far more complicated than the storm outside. The glowing moss lit the chamber with a soft green light, and the pool of clear water gave a little comfort after the endless storm and the battle with the predator. The human sat leaning against the wall, his body aching from wounds and exhaustion. The alien girl sat close by, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring at him quietly. Both of them were alive, but survival was far from easy. The sound of the storm outside still echoed faintly through the tunnels, reminding them that the world beyond was still dangerous. Hunger soon made itself known. The human's stomach growled loudly, breaking the silence. He gave a small laugh at himself, but the girl did not smile. She was hungry too, her body weak and trembling from the cold and from using her energy against the predator. She glanced at the pool, but there was no food in the water. No fish, no plants, only the reflection of their tired faces. The human stood slowly, his muscles stiff. He looked around the chamber for anything useful. The girl watched as he gathered bones and sharp stones left behind from the predator's past kills. He used strips of his torn clothes to tie pieces together, shaping a crude spear. She tilted her head, studying his hands carefully. His work was rough, clumsy compared to the delicate tools her people would craft, but there was something clever in his movements. He had no training in her people's ways. No natural weapons like her claws, yet he still found a way to fight against the impossible. She thought of her people's strict laws, of how they valued strength of bloodlines, of how they looked down on humans as fragile and unworthy. But as she looked at him now, half naked, bruised, and bleeding, yet still building something with stubborn will, her chest tightened in confusion. Fragile? No. There was nothing fragile about what she saw. The human finished his weapon and pointed toward one of the tunnels that led out of the chamber. He gestured to his mouth, then to her, showing his plan. He would find food. The girl shook her head quickly, pulling at his arm. His wounds were still fresh. If he left, he might not come back. But he gave her a smile that seemed to say, "Trust me." For a long moment, she hesitated, then finally nodded. She followed him, unwilling to stay behind alone. The tunnels ahead were darker, colder, and carried strange echoes. They moved slowly, his torch flickering against the wet stone walls. The human led the way, his spear ready, while the girl stayed close. The ground was slippery, and at one point she nearly fell, but his hand shot out, steadying her before she could hit the rocks. For a brief second, her fingers clung to his, and when she pulled back, her heart was beating faster. She told herself it was just fear, but deep down she knew it was something else. The deeper they went, the more complicated their survival became. Strange insects crawled across the walls, some glowing faintly. The human caught one in his hands, studying it. The girl hissed in warning, it was poisonous. He raised an eyebrow, surprised that she bothered to stop him. She shook her head, making a sharp gesture. Slowly, he understood, dropping the insect. Their communication was clumsy, filled with gestures and half-words, but slowly, it was becoming enough. After a long search, they reached another small chamber where thick fungus grew on the walls. The alien girl rushed forward, touching the plants with recognition. They were edible, though bitter. She tore a few and handed them to the human. He looked at the strange, rubbery pieces with doubt, but her firm nod convinced him. He took a bite and nearly gagged at the taste, making her laugh softly for the first time. The sound was brief, quickly hidden behind her hand, but it lingered in the air like a spark of warmth in the cold cave. They gathered more and returned to the moss-lit chamber. Sitting by the pool, they ate slowly, their hunger dulling but not disappearing. The alien girl's eyes softened as she watched him chew the bitter fungus without complaint. He didn't like it, but he didn't stop. He knew it was survival, and survival meant sacrifice. As they finished, silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence as before. It wasn't heavy with distrust. It was strange, soft, as if both were thinking the same thought, but neither dared to speak it. The human leaned back, closing his eyes, exhaustion pulling at him again. The girl studied his face, every scar, every line of pain. She remembered how he had stood before the predator with only fire and stone. She remembered how he had caught her hand when she slipped, how he had laughed even while bleeding. Her people had always told her humans were weak. But if weakness could fight storms, face monsters, and still smile through pain, then what was true strength? The storm outside began to calm, the roar fading little by little. The air inside the cave felt warmer, less suffocating. The alien girl shifted closer to him without realizing it. Her shoulder brushed against his arm, and she stiffened, expecting him to pull away. But he didn't move. He opened his eyes slightly, glanced at her, and gave a faint smile before closing them again. Her heart raced at the small gesture. For the first time since the flood began, she did not feel completely alone. She whispered softly in her own language, words she knew he wouldn't understand. Maybe we are not so different. They sat like that, side by side, in silence, broken only by the dripping of water and the fading echoes of the storm. They had food, they had fire, and they had each other. But more than that, they had begun to build something else, something fragile yet strong, trust. The complications of survival were not just about hunger or wounds. They were about two strangers from different worlds, forced together by nature, learning step by step to depend on each other. And though neither would say it aloud, both knew deep inside that this bond would outlast the storm itself. The night inside the cave was long, but at last, the storm outside began to weaken. The roar of water grew softer, the thunder moved farther away, and the air carried a fresher smell. The human opened his eyes slowly, his body still sore but stronger than before. The alien girl was already awake, sitting close by, her glowing eyes watching the entrance. She had not slept much. She had stayed alert, as if guarding him, though she would never admit it aloud. When he tried to rise, she quickly steadied him with her hand. He gave her a tired smile, and this time she didn't pull her hand away. For a moment, they stood like that, silent, until the sound of birds echoed faintly from outside. It was the first sign of life since the flood began. Hope returned to their hearts. The human gathered what little strength he had and pointed to the tunnel that sloped upward. She nodded, helping him carry the crude spear he had made. Together, they moved carefully, climbing step by step, their bodies weak but their spirits stubborn. The path twisted and rose until finally, light shone faintly through cracks in the stone. The alien girl gasped softly when they reached the opening. The world outside was no longer a raging sea. The water had lowered, though the land was still wet and broken. Trees were half submerged and mud stretched for miles, but patches of dry ground had begun to appear. The storm had ended, and the sun was finally breaking through the clouds. Its golden light fell across their faces, warming their chilled skin. The human stepped forward first, breathing deeply as if he had been waiting for this moment forever. The girl followed, her eyes wide as she looked at the changed world. For a long moment, they stood side by side in silence, taking in the sight. But their peace did not last. From the distance, figures appeared, her people. A group of alien survivors was moving across the ruined land, their banners raised, their voices sharp. The girl stiffened instantly. She knew them. They were from her clan, but not her family. They were strict, proud, and ruthless. If they saw her standing beside a human, half-naked, wounded, and alive because of him, they would never forgive it. The human noticed her fear. He placed a hand lightly on her arm, a silent question in his eyes. "Do you want to go to them?" She looked at him, her lips pressed tightly. For a moment, she didn't know what to answer. Her people had always been her world, her law, her blood. But then she remembered the flood, the cold, the predator, and the way he had stood beside her when no one else would. The figures came closer. One of them shouted her name. She froze, torn between two worlds. Slowly, she turned her head to the human. His face was calm, though his eyes carried something heavy. He was ready to let her go. He thought she would choose her people over him. He even took a small step back, giving her space. But then something unexpected happened. She reached out quickly, grabbing his hand before he could move farther. Her glowing eyes locked onto his, and her voice was firm, though it trembled. "With you." The human blinked in surprise. He had not expected those words. She squeezed his hand tighter, standing beside him as her people approached. The survivors stopped a few steps away, their eyes widening at the sight. Murmurs spread among them. They saw the human's wounds, the spear in his hand, and the alien girl's closeness to him. Some sneered, others whispered angrily, but she did not let go of his hand. One of the alien leaders stepped forward, his voice sharp and full of judgment. He accused her of breaking tradition, of lowering herself by standing beside a human. The girl's body shook, but she lifted her chin high. She looked at them all and said clearly, "He fought the flood. He faced the predator. He saved me. None of you were there. He was." The crowd fell silent at her words. Some still looked at the human with hatred, others with disbelief, but none could deny the truth in her voice. The human stood quietly, not speaking, not defending himself. He let her words carry the weight, because they were not just about survival. They were about trust. Finally, the leader turned away with a scowl, unwilling to argue further. He gestured for the group to move on, leaving the girl and the human standing together in the broken sunlight. She let out a long breath, her body trembling from the courage it had taken to speak. The human squeezed her hand gently, a silent thank you. She looked at him, her lips curving into the faintest smile. For the first time since the flood began, the fear in her eyes was gone. It had been replaced with something stronger: choice. As they walked forward, the sun rose higher, shining across the ruined land. The storm had taken much, but it had also given something unexpected. Two strangers, once enemies, had survived together. And now, walking side by side, they were no longer just fighting for survival. They were carrying something far more complicated, something that neither flood nor predator could wash away. It was the beginning of a bond that would challenge her people, surprise his, and perhaps one day change both worlds forever.